Hi, it's Dr. Steve Thompson again. This is going to be your Chapter 8 ethics lecture. I am just kind of following along with the Chapter 8 PowerPoint. This would be good for you to also follow along. There's some news, reference to newsworthy stuff that relates to guarding ethically, which is what we're talking about. When we talk about guarding, we are talking about in the prison system. So there's kind of the layman's perspective that if you go to prison, you're going to get raped, it's terrible, so forth and so on. So we'll talk about a little bit of those stereotypes and, and some of the unethical or ethical behavior that a prison guard, is responsible for. The prison system is, there's an accreditation agency, which is called the ACA. I believe it's the American Correctional Association. They have a code of ethics. They will even accredit a correctional institution. Accrediting bodies basically list a set of rules and regulations, policies that people are supposed to apply, and they don't really look at what happens. They just look at policies, and they'll look and say, well, your policy is this, and they'll say, well, that's okay, and now you're accredited. A lot of these accrediting organizations, like in law enforcement, we have something called CALEA. That's the Commission on something for the Accreditation of Law Enforcement. They say it will reduce your civil liability. With that said, I have never seen a single attorney look at an agency that had an accreditation and go, oh, they're accredited, I probably can't sue and win. So I think it's kind of a myth or a selling point that really doesn't come to fruition or prevent any type of lawsuits. The president of the ACA for a while was a gentleman named Mr. Epps, and we'll talk about him at the end of this lecture. Mr. Epps, was I believe, the director of the correction system in the state of Mississippi, and received 100% scores under the Mississippi Department of Corrections under his leadership, and we'll see how that worked out very shortly. So, inside the prison system, there's not a lot of cameras everywhere, and things can happen or even be covered up. It's very difficult to get access to those videos. They're not available to the public if a video exists. But the corrections officers get a lot of freedom and leeway on how they treat the inmates. So that does leave room for things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and so forth. So the inmates can sue, and if they can get access to an attorney or even file a lawsuit themselves, and a lot of them do. But it's kind of hard to prove, obviously, when it's not on video. But it should be a very trusted position, and should be staffed by people who are ethical, educated, and understand their jobs and how to do that in an ethical manner. But that isn't always the case. But there's a lot of good correctional officers out there doing it the right way for the right reason. Examples of unethical uses of force. There's some study out there by Walker in '96, but they studied it and the policies, that is, and there's always a policy that says if someone attempts to escape, deadly force is expressly authorized. In fact, a personal story of mine was there was a lot of flooding in Louisiana, and as a state trooper who was also a member of the SWAT team, we were sent to escort the inmates from Angola prison where they thought they were going to be subject to flooding and possibly just unsafe conditions, so they had to escort them out. And we were on the exterior, the Louisiana Department of Corrections, inside the buses that were transporting. They had vans following the bus, and then they had us. We were full tactical gear, unmarked vehicles, and our job was basically, if they got off the bus, let DOC handle it. If they got outside the first row of DOC security, they were to be shot. That was the rules of engagement. If they attempted to escape, if they got outside of their control, they were escaping, and deadly force was authorized. And unless we could basically guarantee that they wouldn't escape without firing a shot, then we were to use deadly force at that point. So we don't use warning shots. That's a thing of the past, and not something that exists in law enforcement anymore, at least that I'm aware of. Let's talk a little bit about rape in prison. Prisons do have a reputation for people being sexually abused, and that could be inmate on inmate, or it could be inmate or guard on inmate. Even if the sex is consensual, a male guard in a female prison system, might even have consensual sex with somebody, or what the guard will perceive as consensual sex, where it cannot be consensual because of the power relationship that the guard would have over the female inmate or male inmate, depending on the circumstances. But when two people are in a cell, it's difficult to prevent that, and the response to that has been lacking. As in, if an inmate reported a rape or sexual abuse, there was not really a lot of protection in the past. So in 2003, the President of the United States signed PREA, which is what stands for Prison Rape Elimination Act. And basically it required some level of protection to prevent inmates from being raped. Because you go to prison for, we'll say, stealing a car, you go to prison for drug possession, you go to prison for tax evasion, whatever the case may be. The incarceration is the punishment. Part of that punishment should not be being sexually abused, raped, tortured, so forth. A lot of people say, well, if you're a child molester, then it's okay. Like it's kind of a comically socially acceptable. And again, it's not. These are, if you subscribe to, we'll say, the formalism aspect of an ethical theory, the rape of anybody under any circumstances would obviously be an ethical violation. So they have made strides and given inmates who are no longer under the do whatever you want system, which is the way it was for a long time. Now prisoners do have rights, they can sue, so that kind of changes the game a little bit. And the failure to protect an inmate from, we'll say, known or preventable sexual abuse could result in civil liability. We have a contemporary issue involving rape and even the placement of inmates in a correctional facility, such as if a person born with male or female genitalia and identifies with the opposite sex and decides to be transgender, where is the prison system supposed to put that person? So that's kind of an ethical dilemma that has presented itself, whereas a male who identifies as female goes into an all-male prison facility and suffers possibly sexual abuse because of the female type, the identification of a female, and the other inmates see that inmate as a female and commit sexual abuse or harassment or whatever. It is an ethical issue, but the trick is, what do we do with that? You'll have opponents to this say, well, I'm a male, I have never been a transgender or anything like that, but I'm going to prison and I feel like I could spend my time in prison a little more enjoyable by just identifying as a female, going into a female prison with the specific objective of being housed with a female inmate and sexual abusing the female inmate, regardless of who that might be. That's an argument on the other side of it. I'm not going to step on either side of the argument. I'm just going to say it is a common court issue. And right now, most places, not all, I think some are actually allowing an inmate to choose their sex and where to be housed. So, and that's going to come up in numerous court cases. But in most states, it's if you were born with male genitalia, you're going to be housed with males. You're born with female genitalia, you'll be housed with females. But, when and if we should change that, it's an ethical issue that will let somebody, the major policymakers are going to have to make that decision. Types of corruption in the criminal system, as far as prison guards go, you've got just simply stealing stuff that they have, trafficking, smuggling, and contraband, sneaking stuff in because you're going to work with your friends. You walk through the detectors or the drug sniffing dogs or whatever, and they may not have those things at all, and you're able to sneak that stuff in and give it to inmates. Typically how a guard would be caught doing something like that is one of the inmates gets caught doing something or wants some type of leniency and will just say, hey, look what I can give to you, and they'll turn over the prison guard. That in and of itself should just say, hey, I don't want to do this, because obviously the inmate there's a good chance they're going to snitch, we call it. And then we also have smuggling in contraband, embezzlement, and misuse of authority, as in abusing inmates and stuff like that, not letting inmates use the phone, or delivering, maybe the person's in jail on assault of a police officer and they deliver a little extra street justice while in the prison system. Probation and parole, the decision to release somebody is, a big decision, and that the probation and parole officers, that is, once they get out, they're responsible for supervising these inmates. And a lot of people in society will say annoyed, or like, why were they out in the first place? And if they were out, why weren't they properly supervised? That is definitely an issue. But when a probation or parole officer has 200 people on their caseload and they're supposed to do a home visit every month, it's impossible. It's downright impossible. You'll hear me talk about later the case on J.C. Dugard, where she was kidnapped when she was 11 years old, held in captivity for roughly 18 years. The person that kidnapped her was on parole for kidnapping, and the home where she was held in captivity was visited by law enforcement or probation and parole 63 times, and they never discovered, oh, there's a kidnapped victim here. And the kidnapped victim, not only was she there, she had been raped and had 2 children with her kidnapper. And she had, when she was 14, she had her first child, and when she was 16, she had her second child. She's a friend of mine. I've actually brought her to Lake Charles, Louisiana, or through a grant, brought her to provide law enforcement training to retain compassion. So all officers will kind of, one of those officers, maybe those 63 visits would have just opened their eyes a little bit. Maybe they would have discovered her long before. So she does work like that to try to make it better instead of just complaining about it. Let's see. I'm on the second to last slide. I got 2 examples here. Let's start with one who committed criminal acts. This is the ACA president, Chris Epps. He was the director for the Department of Corrections of the state of Mississippi, MDOC it's called. And he had 2 Mercedes-Benz, a $300,000 home, and this was a while back when a $300,000 home was kind of a big deal, and a beach house. I don't know how much the beach house was worth, but he was convicted of bribery and kickbacks from private prison officials and healthcare providers. So providing healthcare to inmates is big business. It has to be provided. It's done through state government contracts or state and federal government contracts. So those, we're talking about big money. So the company that gets that contract is, some of them, they really want it because they make millions and millions of dollars of profit off of it. Well, Mr. Epps was willing to sell that to the highest bidder, basically. And so he is now, I believe, doing 20 or 25 years in prison. I can't remember if you want to Google it. He's still in prison to my knowledge. So, he took his position as the leader of the organization and did all these things and basically sold it. And my question would be, not only he's not supposed to do that, he's abusing his position, but given all the extra money that was given to him for that purpose, just so this private company could get massive profits, my question would be, I wonder what the health care provided to the inmates. I wonder the quality of that. I wonder how the employees who provide that health care were treated. Likely much less than they should have been with the major absence in funds and the profiteering that was going on with it. So like I said, he's in prison, but he was the president of the ACA, which is, the organization said, oh, you're doing a great job. And he told his own organization, the Mississippi Department of Corrections, they were doing a great job. That's kind of comical. And the last one, this is a sheriff. I don't know his name, but he was an Alabama sheriff, and he bought a $750,000 beach house with 1 year of profits from basically giving inmates substandard food, the cheapest possible. I think it was down to like 50 cents a meal, something like that, and they're like 20 cents a meal, some ridiculously low number. And he was given like $1.50 per meal for each inmate. He was allowed by law to keep those profits, so he got the meal costs down to where the inmates were basically starving, and he was able to take 1 year of profits from that and go buy a beach house. And this is perfectly legal, and he justified it by saying it's perfectly legal. When, if you look at this from an ethical perspective, formalism says it's perfectly legal, except for, and acceptable, at least the process of it. The problem with formalism is one of the methods was to starve the inmates, so that makes it in a violation of formalism. Having starving inmates would also be a violation of utilitarianism. It's not a good outcome. But a virtuous person definitely would not say, "Oh, let me keep the money for myself while you starve." So we'll say that's a violation of all 3 ethical theories, and there's no way for him to justify it other than him saying, "Oh, this is perfectly legal." Well, slavery was perfectly legal. That doesn't make it right. Well, I think this gentleman here, if you brought slavery back, he'd be the first in line to have a couple slaves and own human beings and be a despicable human being. So perfectly legal, violation of, we'll say, not a violation of the law, but definitely a violation of every moral, ethical theory out there. So that's all I have for chapter 8. We'll see you again in chapter 9.